Hello everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be answering a very interesting question, which I get asked quite a bit. The question of why are you Muslim? Why do you believe? And I think I get asked this question quite a bit because I don't really look or sound quintessentially Muslim. The average Westerner, especially if they are of a more secular liberal disposition, as many are, is not so likely to ask this question to somebody who looks like an immigrant or looks like they may be of a different race. But I think if you look like them, if you talk with a similar accent, if you have qualifications in a secular higher institution, especially if this is qualifications or a job in science, as is the case with myself, and are still Muslim, they are sometimes curious, sometimes almost offended even, and they, well, in my experience, might well ask such questions, which I'll be looking at today. So a little bit of background though. Firstly, I think it is very important to note that belief is certainly not a given for one surrounded by a secular society, neither amongst Muslims who are born as such or Muslims who are converts, particularly when that individual has no real community per se. And yes, I've grown up knowing Muslims, but I wouldn't really say as part of a wider community as such. Now, communities certainly have their problems. They can be stifling, they can be filled with toxic subcultures, and this can even give people the desire to leave the culture and the associated religion. So I'm not necessarily saying that any culture is better than none, but I would say that these negative features of communities are not necessary intrinsic features of community life, and so on balance, I would say being part of a religious community typically outweighs the problems associated with them. And especially as we live in an increasingly atomized society, so atomized so-called individual people who are told and who believe that they are free are much easier to control by the state or the corporate oligarchy. And as a result, the secular liberal establishment has basically presided over the destruction of most of the community and religious life in much of the Western world. So anyway, my point is that communities and community life are important for one's faith to nourish itself and grow amongst similarly minded people. And this, by the way, is probably one of the reasons why, say, American Muslims actually have a much higher rate of leaving the faith as opposed to, say, British ones, even though you might intuitively think Americans are more likely to believe in God than British people, and wouldn't an American culture nurture a religious society a little bit better? But apparently not. And in Western societies in general, actually, let's think about it. If virtually all of one's friends and colleagues are either complete unbelievers or nominal Christians, it's not really surprising that too many Muslims follow suit. And it really saddens, or rather sickens me, I guess, that many elders in the community just don't seem to get or even really think about this, even for a moment. I mean, in particular, many Muslim immigrant families are really happy to chase a dollar and the visa and emigrate to, let's say, Canada or the US with no thought, none, as to the challenges that this will pose for the faith of their kids. And I'm not saying that emigration to these places is necessarily bad, but at the moment, it really does seem to happen with no thought at all for how to nurture one's faith in an environment which will be at best dismissive towards it. And I'm not also saying, by the way, that faith cannot thrive in Western society, nor denying that it can be stifled and institutionalized in a Muslim majority country, making the person want to leave, etc. But the subject as a whole really does need some more thought. So anyway, to cut a long story short, community really matters, and I haven't really had too much of that growing up. I went to a secular school, some students Christians, many of them non-believers, and I did reasonably well, particularly with the sciences, which I studied at university and later became a science teacher. But Muslims in this kind of position, though, so no community, studying higher education, particularly something like the sciences, are extremely spiritually vulnerable. And I think even though it is a little bit of an atheist trope that intelligent people are more likely to be non-believers, it does actually contain a little bit of truth in it, in that somebody who is quote unquote intelligent, if you like, is not only more likely to absorb and retain more of their education along with all the secular paradigms that are weaved into education at the moment, but they are also more likely to arrive at the logical conclusions of their secular upbringing, society, and education. So if they're told, for example, all of the times where religion opposed science, or how evolution by natural selection is necessarily contrary to a faith-based understanding of the world, yet also has overwhelming proof, they'll just connect all that they've learned together and come to the conclusion that the secular establishment wants, which is that quote unquote religion is a simplistic and dangerous waste of time. They'll also invariably contrast the advanced material that they've been learning to the relatively, let's be honest, unadvanced sounding things which they're likely to hear in the mosque from elders in the family, etc. And God willing, I will do a future video on religion, atheism, and intelligence, but I've digressed enough. I've digressed enough already. So in the intellectual and spiritual battle that so many Muslim parents are still shamelessly and completely ignorant about, I was growing up, like many Muslim and Christian and other youth really, pretty much unarmed. So what reasons did I come across to believe, and which ones do I think are the most compelling? Well, I came across the scientific miracles of the Qur'an narrative, which I guess gave some initial excitement, but I soon started to see problems with this narrative. Firstly, I could see that some of the proofs were clearly pretty contrived, like the miraculous scientific nature of the prohibition of pork. I realized that even if pork was inherently dangerous or likely to harbor parasites, or even as certain Muslim televangelists have claimed, would make the consumer somehow behave like a pig, not too much scientific knowledge would be required for that. And the claims were pretty dubious anyway. See a great video, by the way, link below to Tim Winter discussing this one below. And additionally, the idea of proving the Quran through modern science really seemed to put modern science on an absolute pedestal, which even I, as a student of science, couldn't truly do, making it the true arbiter of all knowledge. And, you know, I've always been a student of science, but I never really believed it should be the arbiter of all knowledge. And if we accepted this paradigm, what would happen if modern science shifted away from something that appeared to align with the Quran? Consistency would dictate that we say the Quran is incorrect. And also I thought, why hasn't the scientific community converted to Islam en masse? And furthermore, I had arrived at the conclusion that the Quran appeared to utilize a lot of symbolic language. This is something which both so-called fundamentalists, I guess, and skeptics like to roll their eyes at. But I believe this actually makes the faith much more spiritually and intellectually richer rather than compromise it. And it didn't seem very intellectually fair or rigorous to pick out passages which sounded like they could be scientific and then claim that they were definitely speaking about a bespoke scientific phenomenon. Now, I'm not denying that there are some passages which really make you think about the choice of words which God reveals to us in the Quran in light of modern science when we read about things like the universe being expanded, for instance, which we do know, or we think beyond reasonable doubt is happening. But rather than a definite or logical argument, I guess, this became, I would describe it as a soft proof. I don't know if the phrase really makes sense, but something that I guess resonated with me rather than being a knockdown argument, amidst many other reasons, which I'm going to talk about here. So the reason I believe, which I think intuitively is the main reason why many people do, even people who do claim to put a lot of stock into specific arguments, is really because of a general correspondence with the Islamic message to reality in general. There is the properly basic belief in one overriding, all-powerful, all-providing, all-merciful, ultimate reality, which is the ultimate source of all things, which the Qur'an, of course, affirms. And I think people are naturally inclined to believe this, unless specifically taught otherwise. So taught that there are no gods, which most people in the West, on some level by implication, are taught, or that there are also many lesser deities, for instance. And then there's the specific revelation of the Quran itself, which could not have been written by a man in the 7th century, even with the help from others. And even if multiple people wrote it, it would then have many internal discrepancies, which some people have tried to find, but in my opinion, without success. So again, I'm not so into trying to prove the Quran per se by showing how many rhetorical devices it can fit into one sentence, or statistically unlikely patterns with the number 19. And I'm not saying these arguments have no validity to them, but even if they do, they aren't exactly what moves the heart, I guess. So it is, as I've alluded to, the Quranic narrative taken as a whole, its understanding of human nature and behavior, and its understanding of the reader himself or herself. I remember reading Surat al-Baqarah, and there's a description of paradise, one which, if taken literally, would certainly resonate with somebody living in the desert, with its emphasis on coolness, shade, and fruit, but which the modern Western reader might initially try to write off as being, quote unquote, too convenient, too much like, the fantasy of a desert dwelling person, basically. And just as the modern reader is starting to think, yeah, this is too literal to be, spiritually convincing, the Quran immediately reminds us that God does not disdain to use even the parable or the symbol of a gnat, so a tiny little insect, or something even smaller, reminding us that he can and does use metaphor and symbolism, if and when he chooses. And don't think you're too smart or intellectual to be moved by these descriptions of the hereafter, even if they have a symbolic component. And again, I don't see that as compromising the faith. It's our limited comprehension and 3D brains that can't truly conceive of the existence beyond this one. Another one that really struck me is the linguistic link between God's mercy, rahmah, and the womb, which is derived from the same root letters as in Arabic. And I think that is such a profound symbol. That symbol really touched my heart, I guess, which a lot of things can't do very easily, because the womb is maybe the most merciful single entity on earth. It provides protection, nutrition, antibodies, and it's the only existence that an unborn baby knows. And I sometimes think, as a thought experiment, some people say this is like complex and esoteric, but it's just something that I think, which is that would a fetus, an unborn baby, if it could think like an adult, believe while it's in the womb in life after birth? So would the removal from the only existence that it has ever experienced be the end? Does the mother exist? Or is she just a fantasy for those scared of the dark? And is there a better analogy for the mercy provided by the womb to the mercies that we are provided for in this life? Is this otherwise hostile universe that we are constantly being given the mercy of oxygen, water, nutrition, ambient temperature, shielding from radiation, etc.? And what should we be acquiring in this life? And how should we be growing? With our baby analogy, that the baby acquires nutrition to grow and to be healthy, and would be neither healthy nor viable after birth if it does not gather these things successfully. And what about us? What do we need to gather? I think in this life, we're supposed to acquire a nourishment of a different type, one that isn't numerically quantifiable or material, but that is nonetheless very real. Nourishment for the consciousness or soul, if you like, which comes from recognizing our role as conscious and responsible beings created by the ultimate reality, God, and acquiring good works. And our happiness in the next plane of existence, if you like, would depend on how well we have done this. If our scales of good deeds, if you like, are very light, we would be like the diseased and damaged fetus, which only feels suffering after birth because it is not equipped for the life that it is born into. Now, of course, a damaged fetus is not to blame for its own misfortune, and such children which suffer or suffer and die early will, of course, according to Islam, receive an immeasurable mercy in the existence hereafter, but we will be responsible for our own state. As God reminds us when speaking of sinners who are suffering, if you like, in the life hereafter, we do not oppress or sin against them. They sin only against their own selves. So yeah, these are just a couple of the messages in the Quran which have particularly resonated with me, and there are of course more. And then there's the life of the Prophet, upon whom be peace, what he achieved, what was achieved after his death, how his message was so widely believed and is still widely believed by entire nations, from the simple shepherd to the doctor, the scholar, the intellectual. But of course, can't this argument just be used for other religions? Well, yeah. And I actually believe maybe most other religions have divine origins. In fact, as Muslims are, of course, compelled to think that this is true of Christianity and Judaism, of course. But I tend to think that this could be true with other paths as well, like Hinduism, maybe some of the Far Eastern traditions, and Native American ones as well. This, of course, doesn't mean that I think all religions are quote unquote the same. I do believe that other religions have encountered change. So, for example, Judaism would become restricted to one community and not humanity, and Christianity essentially compromised what should have been strict monotheism, etc. But you know, that secular trope that all religions except for one are false, according to all religions, we secularists and atheists, we just go one God or one religion further. It's just a failure. It is just a wanton, deliberate failure to understand what religions actually teach. And another one on a related note, another one is that so-called skeptics, a term which I really don't have a huge amount of patience for, but anyway, so-called skeptics often like to compare prophets to essentially cult leaders. But cult leaders, however, really do seem to have limits in who they can actually recruit. They often only go for a particular type of personality, often the vulnerable and gullible, whereas, of course, the first Muslim community had representation from every level of society. But yeah, cult leaders tend to go for often vulnerable and gullible individuals, and they typically struggle to recruit otherwise reasonable people. They also allocate a lot of importance to their own self and their material wants, along with many other special rights and privileges. And the Prophet, upon whom be peace, didn't do this. I mean, the Quran only mentions him by name, I believe, 4 times, far fewer times than, say, Moses or Jesus, peace be upon them. And yes, later in life, it is true that the Prophet did have multiple marriages, though largely for political reasons, and this was an existing common practice, not a privilege he allocated to himself. And of course, at that stage of life, he could have easily enjoyed the company of many young, beautiful women if he wanted to, as opposed to mostly once married women who were widows and divorcees, as was typically the case, and most of whom would have actually been quite far past their prime in terms of physical beauty. Then, of course, at the start of his ministry, he turned down all sorts of material wealth, including the promises of possessions such as women, to be met with hostility, boycotting, and violence. Then, of course, skeptics, if you like, so-called skeptics, like to speculate about things like personality disorders and other conditions like, epilepsy to explain away the concept of revelation. And I suppose in a way they kind of have to do this. They kind of have to do this to retain their materialist stance. But the Prophet, upon whom be peace, really doesn't objectively seem to have anything that could resemble this. Of course, before his prophethood, he lived a completely normal life for 40 years and was married completely monogamously for 25 years until the death of his wife. Cult leader types often have personality disorders such as narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, and typically, again, think that they are entitled to enjoy lots of women, for example. They show these traits from a very young age on the whole, and long, faithful, loving marriages don't seem to happen much with such personality types. Another trait, of course, such people is pathological lying, even when it doesn't really seem necessary, a very common trait amongst individuals with psychopathy. Yet the Prophet, upon whom be peace, was famed for his honesty even before he became a prophet. And then the whole epilepsy thing, again, that is just a materialist get out. There was no proof that he had it. Again, they just have to say it because they can't accept the reality of the divine, let alone any kind of transmissible message, if you like, from the divine being converted, if you like, into intelligible speech. Of course, things like epilepsy, they get progressively worse. They debilitate the person throughout life, something else which seems to happen. And the other possibility, the so-called possibility, delusional behavior. Again, another stretch. People, to put it mildly, people with delusions really struggle to do things as functional as, running an entire community, having a stable family life, trade, diplomacy, effective deployment of soldiers to defend the community, being trusted by everybody around them, and all of these other things which the Prophet, upon whom be peace, very successfully did. So, is it just too easy? Is it just too easy to say he wasn't lying, wasn't deluded, so he must be telling the truth? Well, maybe. But if you've got somebody who doesn't appear to be suffering from any delusions and seems to be completely sincere, whilst also achieving, even just on a secular level, arguably more than any other human has, wouldn't their claims at least warrant some further investigation? And finally, on a personal level, there's my own life, I guess. And okay, life experiences, including, religious ones, I guess aren't generally considered to be good demonstrable proofs. But for oneself, I think it makes sense to trust your experiences unless you have specific good reason not to. And one of the things which I've felt, as long as I can remember really, is that things seem to happen to and around me for a reason. That for every bad thing, from tragic to just frustrating even, almost always included some kind of, at the very least, lesson or unforeseen benefit, so that I came out of it better or with better insight. Now, believing this obviously doesn't take much religious commitment per se, right? Even people who vaguely say that they just believe in karma, whatever that actually means, they might have such experiences too. But that ultimately these experiences have led me in the direction of Islam and not away from it, seems to me is another reason why I believe. And then, of course, Islam positively affects how I behave. And of course, other religious and secular systems can and do promote pro-social behavior and self-development. But there are usually significant flaws with such systems. Liberalism, for example, does protect and promote human autonomy and does put a lot of value on personal rights of the individual. But on the whole, in my opinion, diminishes too much the value of duties, right? You know, it's all about my rights, my personal wants. And if religion has the gall to obstruct these, to hell with it. Then we look at systems like communism. And by the way, I do effectively regard both liberalism as and communism as de facto religions, but more of that in another video. Anyway, communism values the community and that the individual is part of something greater, but generally denies the reality of God and, to put it mildly, does not have the best regard for individual freedoms. Then Christianity promotes love and charity, but in practice is often so non-prescriptive with its teachings that it often has little relevance in the day-to-day ethics and conduct of many of its followers. But I feel Islam strikes the right balance, and that some guy living in the 7th century desert probably couldn't have just come up with that balance. That balance that, in my opinion, pretty much every other political theorist and social influencer has failed to meet. It doesn't sound so plausible. And I will admit, by the way, that in practice, Islam often ends up having many aspects which become institutionalized to the point where it does not appear to be a simple way of life which puts its followers at ease. But in my view is that in essence, it does inherently have the right level of prescriptiveness so that there are enough specific teachings and not just vague sentiments like be good to significantly and positively affect the ethics of a sincere believer, but without overburdening them. Also, a lot of these so-called strict aspects like not consuming intoxicants and only having sexual relationships with one spouse, these aren't burdensome. These are here to protect us. These are here to physically and spiritually protect us, not because God is some kind of a prudish male-like figure, which of course features so often in secular caricature. Then as for requirements like praying, well, this really shouldn't be a burden, right? If, for instance, a secular self-help book said that for your mental health, you should take 5 to 10 minutes out of your day, away from everybody else, just to yourself, and you should do this 5 times, or maybe you should meditate for an hour in the day, no one would really call this intrusive. And prayer essentially does all of these things. Prayer fulfills all of those so-called quiet time meditation functions, but with even more on top. So I think on many levels, Islam makes sense, but I'd also like to add that the materialist worldview, in my view, does not. And unsurprisingly, atheists are generally a lot better at attacking religions rather than defending their own position, sometimes claiming that they, quote unquote, don't even have one. Then as for other different religions, as I've said so before, I do think on some level they make sense. But ultimately, the worship of divine unity, that is God, as prescribed by Islam, makes more sense in my view than, let's say, compromising that unity by saying that God is a triune being or whatever the case may be. But yeah, the atheistic materialist worldview, popular as it is, doesn't make so much sense to me. And okay, I mean, for a start, there's nothing to gain from it. So when we die, both the murderer and the sadist, they get off scot-free, whereas the murdered and the abused never get their justice. And why not kill yourself if you'll only cease to exist? Why not cheat on your spouse? There's no one up there to watch you, right? That feeling of guilt is just chemicals in your brain. In fact, from a evolutionary Darwinian perspective, and by the way, I'm not saying that evolution on some level isn't true or isn't real, but anyway, another video. But and from an evolutionary perspective, if you cheat on your spouse, this is not really a bad thing. You could potentially be spreading your unique transferable genes further, so to speak. And by the way, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that non-believers necessarily behave like this. Of course not. But they're not being inconsistent if they chose to do so. And in actual fact, whether somebody is a bespoke believer or not, I think that all or most people actually feel the good, whether they accept it to be anything more than an evolutionary byproduct or not. Then, of course, something else that I say, which ruffles a few feathers sometimes, is that almost all Western non-believers are, and they really hate it when I say this, not that I see it as an insult, but almost all Western non-believers are effectively Christians, just without the theological dimension of Christianity. So systems, for example, like the much vaunted welfare system in the famously non-religious Scandinavia, they were made based on the principles of Lutheran Christianity. And another, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but another kind of food for thought is, Muslims, Christians, and others, I guess, we often sometimes wonder why popular atheist spokespeople, personalities, comedians, etc., feel the need to mock our faiths. Why be so rude? Why be contemptuous and smug? Are they just rude or more arrogant people? Maybe in some cases, but I actually think that they really have to be like that for the arguments to sound psychologically compelling. Also, religions are about thought and contemplation. If you can, by use of mockery and sarcasm and so-called humor, if you can remove or prevent people from being in that state of thought and contemplation, maybe even a little bit of melancholy, they're not going to, or they'll find it a lot harder to seriously engage their minds with the big questions. And I think that's part of the idea as well. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is that I think the arguments, especially the very popular ones that you'll hear from the likes of Richard Dawkins or comedians like Ricky Gervais, even though he seems to be softening a little bit, but the likes of Ricky Gervais or Stephen Fry come up with, once you actually take away the comedic delivery, they're really weak. Take the many gods argument, right? The idea that everybody is an atheist when it comes to all gods but their own, but I just go one god further. And once you understand why, once you understand why you reject Zeus and Thor and Wotan, etc., you'll understand why I reject your god. However, the gods featured in this argument are contingent beings which occupy space and time. So even if their existences actually were taken literally by people in the ancient world, which isn't a given, by the way, they might not have, if that was the case, these gods are essentially supersized monsters, animals, if you like, with extra powers. And there is good reason to believe that no such very large entities exist. But the concept of God, as understood by the major religions, is that there is a being or an ultimate reality, if you like, of which the universe as we know it is dependent on. Oh, and by the way, the proponents of this argument always cheat in their list by saying God, Allah, and Yahweh. It is the same thing in different languages. And then they'll sometimes be like, oh, are you trying to say that God and Allah are the same thing? Well, like, what else do you think Arabic Christians call God? Though, to be fair, I did know an RE teacher, religious education teacher, who actually did assume that this would be the case and that even Jesus himself would have literally said the word God, which does really go to show why most British children are completely religiously illiterate. And yeah, there's a lot more that I'd love to discuss, but God willing, I will save that for another video. I'd love to talk about more things like the problem of evil. That's one. The Scandinavia argument, which I mentioned, which is that the argument that if religion is so great, why is Scandinavia so great when it's irreligious? I've got some interesting responses to that. The most Western scientists are non-believers argument, and lots more. But suffice to say, for now, I think these arguments are very weak. I think that with so-called good or effective delivery and sarcasm, the arguments can come across as having a lot of force. But once stripped of that, Once you take away everything that makes them psychologically compelling, they soon will stop being intellectually compelling. So anyway, that's a brief overview, which turns into a little bit of a ramble, I guess, of why I believe.